Planck field that we're talking about, the plenum itself, you could call consciousness. All the aspects of what you would traditionally think of as human consciousness. Let's talk about it from our perspective, because obviously we're not the only things that have consciousness, right? Animals have consciousness, plants, you could very easily argue, have consciousness. And then you could probably extend it to atoms and this field of entanglement that William was talking about. That's consciousness. So in other words, the universe is probably conscious. Maybe the sun is well aware of what's up on the earth and it intentionally is not sending plasma, huge, because our atmosphere could be gone in seconds if the sun decided to aim some of those particles directly at us, right? So I like to think of the fact that everything is actually conscious. And that is not a traditional way of defining consciousness, but unified physics starts to point towards the fact that you could argue a rock is conscious, because if you start looking at the Planck spherical units in the protons, in the atoms, in the molecules, and then you see how it's all entangled, and you start to take the boxes away because there's no boxes, and you look at the infinite fractal field that rock is a part of, then you're like, there is no boundary. What do you mean? Like, everything's conscious, and then nothing's conscious. It's very confusing, obviously, but that's why that's the hardest question in the world in some ways. But that's the way I like to talk about it, is in this kind of very general and inquisitive kind of way. I feel like I'm always going to be a student, and I will never stop being a student. And that's why this is infinitely interesting, and the universe is infinitely interesting. And so, there's my very big answer to the question.
That's great. I love it.
I'm really curious to see William's back me up on this, William.
For a scientific delineation, which is, I think, what we're interested in here, you've got to use some of those tools from the toolbox of science to begin to characterize consciousness, so that we can begin to build a definition of what we're talking about. So, looking at the defining characteristics of consciousness. And so, we're not jumping yet to what is consciousness. That's because that's, as Jamie said, the most difficult question. And actually, it's right up there with the question, what is life? And if you look in a biology textbook, go look for the definition of life, you won't see an answer to what is life. What is life lists a number of characteristics. Matter that is able to reproduce itself, respond to stimuli, grow, multiply, a list of characteristics, but it doesn't actually say what is life. And actually, I'd like to bring that up just because in our definition, some of the conclusions that we've come to, the answer to what is life is actually intricately linked with the answer to what is consciousness. At least, within this kind of tentative definition of characteristics. But so you look at some of the elements engendering consciousness. You've got communication, communicability, that's the exchange of information. You have the encoding of information, that's memory. The processing of that information, and that is permutation, changing that information. And so you start to see these kind of basal underlying elements of consciousness. And in fact, I think that with 4 or 5 of these, you could actually engender any system to have the characteristics of awareness. Now, whether or not it's aware, actually conscious, I think that the Turing test for that, so to speak, is to see if it has standalone volition, goal-oriented behavior. Standalone volition or goal-oriented behavior is, by definition, non-pre-programmed behavior. It's not computational in nature. It's unpredictable. And that is one of the defining characteristics of consciousness and life, is to a certain extent unpredictable behavior. And so this is also why DNA and genes do not define life, because those follow a kind of deterministic program or behavior for living things, but they're not deterministic in that way. It's epigenetic, But so this kind of unpredictability, non-computational behavior endows the universe with a certain degree of non-deterministic free will. And this is where you get the richness generating variability, diversity. And nothing epitomizes that better than consciousness and life. Look at all the myriad living forms and species, and then all the myriad thoughts and ideas that even one person can have. It's diversity and variation, and it's just constantly able to generate new patterns, new forms, because of this unpredictability. Well, now these are all intrinsic descriptions of the physical mechanisms of the universe. I mean, information exchange, information encoding, memory, information processing. Every single one of these things you can find in that basal structure, that fundamental structure, the Planck density, the vacuum structure. So, if those are the elements engendering awareness, you can kind of legitimately say, well, there's this intrinsic sentience and ubiquitous awareness to the universe itself. And this is very much a factor of holofractographic physics. And it's a scale-free system. And this is what's so important about what Jamie was saying about a rock having consciousness, is that sure, when you look at it at a certain scale, the mesoscale, the molecular level, it doesn't have the components to have those elements engendering awareness. Like, the molecules in the rock, at least overtly, don't look like they would have the capability to exchange information, encode information, and process information. Probably processing information is the big one for inanimate objects. But you have scale-free complexity. So if you look at kind of the subatomic levels, the level of the atom and below, and certainly at the Planck scale, you have almost the same degree of complexity as what you find in the human brain. So the awareness is there. And then, of course, that is one holistic, unified field, space memory, that, we're a part of, everything's a part of, it's all entangled. So, I mean, you can start to look at what consciousness is, perhaps more from a scientific perspective than metaphysical, mystical perspective. It's an intrinsic element of the universe, mechanism, dynamic, that's generating variability, diversity, hence evolution, and increasing complexity, and organizational synergy.